So it's a new month as we move into May. And so in our plan for this year, that means we're opening up a new front, so to speak, in terms of our lesson series and what we're focusing on. And so this month is kind of a natural follow-up, no pun intended, on what we started last month as we thought about leading. This month we're going to focus on following. And so, as we are with most of these months, we'll spend this morning looking at the example that Jesus set as a follower for us. It's interesting to stop and think about Jesus as a follower. It's not something that we hear nearly as much about or hear framed about as we think about Jesus as a leader. His leadership is the stuff of thousands of books, probably, and many lessons, and on it goes. But thinking about Jesus as a follower isn't something that is quite as prevalent, at least in maybe an obvious way. But I think as we stop and think about it, we realize that Jesus and his example in following is as much a part of his identity on this earth as his example as a leader. And so that's what we'll spend our time focusing on this morning, Lord willing. I want to just quickly kind of share something I was thinking about as I was putting some of these thoughts together. It kind of struck me in some sense that there's some unique challenges in following, just on a personal, practical level that maybe aren't quite as there with leading. And don't want to suggest that one is harder than the other, but when we think about leading over here, if I can get my screen to work, God leads us, and as we looked at last month, we have the opportunity to lead others. And sure, that's an oversimplification of that. I get that. But at a high level, that's kind of the flow of we see of how leading works. But when we think about following, it's a little more nuanced, a little more complicated in the sense that we follow God, but at the same time, there are situations where we follow others. And in some cases, those others are following God. In some cases, they're not. And so that simple cascade of leading doesn't quite work the same way when we think about following. And if we put leading and following together, that just makes it even more nuanced. The reality is that there are people that we follow that we're also trying to lead, right? As we think about the different ways in which we would consider the ideas of following and leading. We looked last month on the idea that we have the opportunity to lead everyone that we interact with. We have the opportunity to lead, to influence the cause, to think about the relationship with God and help point them on that path and encourage them as they go along that way. But there's a very real sense in which those people that we might be trying to lead, influence, are also people that we're in turn following in the different roles and relationships that we have on this earth. And so figuring out how to work this and balance this is something that is worthy of our consideration as we go along this month, and putting these two together, because they're not divorced from each other. They're not disconnected. We both lead and we follow in some instances. And so those two things can and should work together. But our focus this morning is going to be on how Jesus demonstrated leadership over the next few minutes. And so, as we've noted already, his time on earth, if we really stop and think about it, was defined as much by him as a follower as by a leader. We'll note this as we go along, but I was reminded even over the last few weeks that while there are instances in which Jesus identifies with leadership, he more often than not identifies himself as a follower. And as we stop and think about the ways in which he followed, that will be important for us. But as much as we talk and think about Jesus as a leader, his example was equally strong to us as a follower and what it looks like to be a true and committed follower as we go along. And so, while it may seem at first a little bit odd to think in this way, I think it's good to challenge and think about how Jesus demonstrated following to us and what he demonstrated as a follower. There's a few things that we would note at the beginning that are maybe obvious, but certainly worth noting anyway. One is that Jesus knew when not to follow, right? He knew when to say, this is a situation in which I shouldn't follow someone else's lead. And the two most obvious examples of that, of course, are as it relates to when Satan tried to tempt him in the wilderness at the beginning of the ministry, and the multiple attempts that the Jewish leaders made to have him end up in some way as a follower of them. The interesting thing to note about those two situations, at least for me, in this point of knowing when not to follow, we often associate this with, I don't follow someone, that's trying to lead me to do something that's sinful, or some of those types of things. Yet in these examples, and maybe they aren't the only examples, but in these examples in Jesus's life, um, what we recognize is that people are trying to lead Jesus with Scripture. People are trying to lead Jesus with this perception of being religiously and spiritually focused. And those are the instances in which Jesus had to make the decision not to follow. So often, like I said, we focus on not following those who reject God and are worldly and completely cutting themselves off from God. But yet, what we see is in Jesus' life demonstrated again and again is he had to recognize when those who are talking religion, talking spirituality, talking scripture actually weren't to be followed because of various reasons that we won't go into for this study. So, of course, it's important that we know when not to follow, but perhaps is worthy for us to think about what kind of situations might we not follow? Because maybe these types of examples don't come to mind quite as obvious as we think about the way that people are trying to have a following today. And even those that are using the perception of God or the perception of a commitment to God to be a leader and to have us follow them. Along with that, Jesus recognized that following others wasn't incompatible with following God. It wasn't an either or thing that was mutually exclusive between the two. He knew that there were times when it was appropriate and necessary to follow, to follow the instructions, to follow the commands. And of course, the most obvious example of that is with the authority of the Romans. Jesus, when those leaders who are, showing the perception of being spiritually focused were trying to trick him about how it relates to government, he recognized that there are things that are to be given to government. There are things that are to be given to authority. There are times when their lead is to be followed. And rather than drawing a distinction between you can't do that because you follow God, he actually recognized that there is a compatibility between our following of God and our following of others who may be put in a position to have some authority over us. And so, we might get into a bigger discussion around following versus submission and some of the nuances about those types of things. But certainly at a high level, we recognize that Jesus and the writers that God entrusted with his message made it clear time and time again that it's not incompatible, that there are times when we are going to have to follow others' lead here on this earth. And that doesn't mean that then we are somehow contrary to God if we recognize the need to follow others in those situations. And so we see that demonstrated in multiple instances in Jesus' time as he walked this earth. One of the key points, I want to just look at a few references here as we think about this one, but one of the key things that Jesus pointed out multiple times was that he was not following his own will, but the one who sent me. Let's turn to John 6, if you would. John in particular, and you'll note that all the references that I've pulled out here are from John. It's certainly not exclusive to John, but John in particular is making this point about Jesus and his will. And so if we read, let's pick up in John 6 and let's read beginning in verse 35 as Jesus is in this midst of, he's just fed the 5,000 and continued on from his journey from there. And so we have this discussion then in the middle of chapter 6, after he's said this, we have this discussion where he's drawing on this picture about being on the bread of life. And so picking up in verse 35 of chapter 6, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. And turn over to John chapter 12, if you would. Towards the end of John chapter 12, Jesus, in the midst of this conversation about about his purpose in life and this exchange that he has with the people who are not believing and not going along. He says, beginning verse 44, and Jesus cried out and said, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my word and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me has given himself me, who has the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that this commandment is eternal life. What I say, therefore, I say as the Father has told me. There's several others that we could turn to, and certainly probably the one that maybe most often jumps to our mind along this line is as Jesus prayed in the garden. He prayed to the Father, let not my will, but thy will be done. And so often we think about Jesus's love for us and all that that entails, and perhaps we miss the somewhat uncomfortable realization that these passages draw out for us is that Jesus, even though he has this deep love for us, he points out time and time again that what he's doing is following the will of his Father, not his own. He's putting his own will in submission to the one who he's followed, into God. He's putting that will aside and following the Father's will in all things. And so as we recognize that, the first point there, of course, is the idea of putting aside our own will, recognizing when our own will is different, and being committed to the will of the one who sent us. So often we want to focus on changing the will of the one that we follow, right? In some way, we want to compel the one that we follow to change their will. But Jesus shows us again and again his willingness to submit to the will of the one who sent him. At the same time, we see in that reference there at the end of Jesus's ministry that there is a time in which he approaches the Father and asks if there's any other way, let it happen. And so he's recognizing that his will is different. He's recognizing that he knows that what the Father is willing in this situation, if there's any way not to follow through with this, he's asking the Father for that consideration, but yet at the same time, he shows the commitment to the Father's will and the respect that he should have to that, and says at the end, ultimately, not my will, but yours be done. So what Jesus demonstrates there is not only the ability or the commitment to put aside his own will, but also an appropriate way of how to deal with the situations where our will is different. And we want to consider, is there any other way? He demonstrates both examples there, both the commitment to someone else's will, but also the way in which it's appropriate to respond and address when that will is different from what he would want to pursue himself, or at least how he would want to pursue that. And so he showed how to address that difference between the two wills. And of course, we ultimately see that he learns obedience here through the following of that will. We see in the references in Hebrews about how Jesus learned obedience through suffering. It's not a direct statement of Jesus's of following per se, but we understand that that suffering came as a result of his commitment to follow the will and the direction that God had given him. And so, as he demonstrates, though Jesus was perfect in all things, he himself still had this opportunity to learn what obedience looked like as it related to following and to encountering the experiences that following related to him or conveyed to him. And so, that commitment to learn obedience to someone else's will is something that Jesus showed us in so many different ways. And again, he points himself out at many times in his ministry that he is making this commitment to follow someone else's will. And even though he recognizes the hardship, he recognizes the difficulty, he commits to following that will to an extreme point. And that's really the next point to share here is that not only does he have this commitment and this willingness to learn what this looks like, but he's willing to do that at extreme cost to himself. Turn over to Matthew chapter 8, if you will. I apologize, my screens are getting a little jumbled here. which is why it's bouncing back and forth a little bit. But if you turn to Matthew chapter 8, as people are talking about following Jesus, he makes this point here in the middle of this chapter as one considers following it. He says, beginning in verse 18, "Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. And a scribe came up and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.' Another of the disciples said to him, 'Lord, let me first go and bury my father.' And Jesus said to him, 'Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own.'" And so while this isn't a statement necessarily of Jesus following, it's a statement about others who wish to follow him. He's pointing out in this example, in this exchange, that the Son of Man himself has no comfort in these circumstances. He has no luxury. He's enduring hardship over and over again as he seeks to do the Father's will. And so what we see is not just his willingness to follow, but his willingness to follow no matter the circumstances, no matter the cost to him personally. He recognizes ultimately where this is going to lead him, right? His willingness to give up his own life is what drives him throughout this, what drives his complete picture of following. But on a daily basis, this was hardship to him. On a daily basis, he had no place to lay down and rest in a comfortable way. And yet he showed a commitment that despite that, that he was going to follow through with what God had led him and called him to do. No matter the hardships, no matter the difficulty, he had this commitment to follow through to completion what God had laid out for him. And he's reminding his followers that the same is going to be asked of them. Those who seek to follow God, just as we mentioned this morning already, must expect that suffering and hardship will come as a result of this commitment to follow. And so we see what that looks like in Jesus as he walks this earth and shows that commitment to follow through what God had laid down for him. And the final thing I want to consider about Jesus as a follower in this example is ultimately he followed for the benefit of others. He wasn't following because there was something for him at the end of this that was better than what he had before. He gave up the best that any could have, right? He gave that up to follow, not because it held a benefit for him, but because it held a benefit for others. His commitment to follow had a reward that was derived by someone else, not of his own account. And so certainly we see that God is pleased with Jesus on this. And I don't want to take away from that in any way, that there's that aspect of this. But ultimately what Jesus did was showed us that following isn't about us. It isn't about where this will lead us necessarily. It may be that following leads us into a place that is good or into a place that is beneficial to us. But as Jesus demonstrated it, the benefit was not to himself. The benefit was to those who he seek to lead. He recognized as he went through this that what he was doing was for others people's benefit. And beyond that, he recognized that what he was doing was showing others how to follow. He was not only doing these things because it was important for what it made possible for them in terms of redemption and salvation, but he recognized that what he was doing was giving the example that others were going to have to replicate after he left. What did it look like to follow in a way that showed a complete commitment to God and to his purposes? What did it look like to show to be a follower who is no matter the cost, no matter the hardship, no matter the difficulty, going to see those things through to the end? And Jesus, throughout his ministry, recognized that what he was laying down for us was both the benefit of his following, but also the example of his following. He knew the hardship that others were going to have that came after him. He knew the hardship, as we looked at when we read from John 17 a few weeks ago, that his followers were going to have when he left. And so what he gives in his demonstration of following is an example of what that looks like. That is as impactful as any that we could see or any that we could try to emulate. And so he lays this out for us and helps us to see what it means to be a true follower. As we go forward over the rest of this month and think about these lessons, obviously most of these points relate to how Jesus followed God. in what that looked like. And certainly, as we seek to be followers, we have to have that same priority of focus. But the challenge for us is going to think about, how do I take these same principles of following and apply them in those situations where I'm called to follow someone else, whether it's in a workplace environment or whether it's in a relationship that I have, where that person has some type of leadership or authority over me, from a worldly perspective, if you will. And what we recognize is Jesus didn't make exception. And as we see through the rest of the text, we're not going to find exceptions, for this example that he had for some of these other places where we would follow. And so the challenge for us is to figure out how we take this attitude that Jesus had, and as a follower, and first and foremost, put it to our commitment to follow God. But then, how do we follow the others that we're going to be in a situation to follow? How do we have that same commitment that despite the hardships, despite the fact that my will may be different in certain situations, I still follow the example and the demonstration that he led for us? And so as we spend time over the next few weeks, let's keep those challenges in mind. Clearly, we all know that we need to follow God like Jesus followed God. We need to follow Jesus as Jesus followed God in his example. But then recognize that this same demonstration that Jesus had for God applies to us too in all the other situations which we may be called to follow others. And that sometimes is harder for us. Again, going back to the point that there are times when we want to condition our following based on whether someone is worthy or someone is right. And we don't question those things about God, of course. But maybe those are more challenging to us when we think about applying that from a worldly perspective and the different relationships that we have, where we may be called to follow others in our walk. So hope that stirs some thoughts to think about both Jesus as a leader and what he showed us as a follower and what he showed us as a follower, but then also to think ahead as we look at following our lives, following in our congregation, following in our homes, following in our interactions with others. We are going to need to follow. And what does Jesus show us in his following of God that we can apply, and how do we apply that in our following of others? So with that, I'll conclude my thoughts for this morning, and I'll turn it back over to Brett or Andy as we consider a couple of songs now.